Hobaragani ladies. Black Women Work began as an online space for Black women to share challenges and successes, an affirming space for us to love on each other, express ourselves, and cheer each other on. As we know, we are navigating so much our families, children, partners, spouses, careers, and the dynamics around both race and gender, all while we're trying to live our best lives in 2020. So we decided to take our talents to podcasting and created HeadWraps, powered by Black Women Work. We're excited to share our third episode today, Black Wealth. My name is Michelle Felder, also known as Felder, and sometimes Minnie Malcolm. And I am an entrepreneur, a friend, a lover of travel, good conversations over cocktails, and justice for Black people. I'm excited to introduce my co-host and fellow BWW co-founders, Keisha Chambers, Valisa Turner Howard, and Erica Merritt.
Hello, everybody. My name is Keisha Chambers. I am an engineer, an entrepreneur, a Southern girl who likes her grits with sugar. I'm also a wine lover, and I'm patiently waiting for us to be able to have safe travel again.
Hi, everyone. I'm Valisa Turner Howard, and I am a wife, a mother, a good friend, an entrepreneur, and someone who really feels that the space we've created in Black Women Work was needed, is necessary, and continues to give the gift of freedom for Black women.
My name is Erica Merritt, and I'm an entrepreneur, a mother, a wife, a lover of science fiction, and an unwavering advocate for racial justice.
Excellent. Well, ladies, this was not planned when we mapped out our podcast topics for the year, but it is just so fitting that we're going to discuss Black wealth on the fourth day of Kwanzaa, which is Yujama, cooperative economics.
We're so good.
So Black wealth is a broad topic that could be discussed over several episodes, but we will do our best to do it justice in the time that we have here. So let's get at it. First, let's just define wealth. Webster defines it as an abundance of valuable materials, possessions, or resources. Now, some might identify abundance with being rich. The simple difference between a rich and a wealthy person is that wealthy people sustain wealth. In other words, a wealthy person will be wealthy, whereas someone who is rich will only be for a short while until the money's gone. What defines wealth for you all?
I would say freedom, independence, the ability to get up and go and not think about, do you have to be somewhere at a certain time? Do you have to do something for someone else? You know, really being able to be free, to be you, to live the life that you would want to live. I think that's a piece of it. And that's monetary, but that's also being wealthy in relationships, in family, in other ways as well.
I think wealth is a peace of mind. It is that ability to know that if you want to do something, if there's a cause you want to support, if there's something you want to build for your community, even your family, you are able to do it. There's no barriers if you have wealth. I think wealth also extends to your health. There's a saying, your health is your wealth. And if you have that, then you're able to also, be independent, do the things you want to do. You're able to thrive. You're able to be there for your family, to support them in what they need. So health is important as it relates to wealth. And then wealth also means you're a leader in your community, and people look up to those that have money. We have an unfortunate example here leaving the office here soon, but people tend to look up to those that have wealth, and mostly because those people that do have wealth are usually very supportive of the causes that are important to them.
Yeah, sorry. I was just gonna say, I think about it in similar ways to the ways that Valisa and Keisha have already described it, particularly as I think about the way that I have always felt wealthy has been in my relationships and in my connections to other people. But I think the older that I get, the more I think about wealth in terms of having resources that I can pass down to the next generation. So really thinking about sustainability, surely my experience while I'm here on the planet, and that of my family, but also what will I leave behind for my son, for uh, my grandchildren, for generations to come.
That's great. I think it's interesting. I would agree with every definition or description that all of you provided but I think it's interesting how we described other things besides money in our thoughts about wealth and the pillars of wealth, such as health, social wealth, which are friendships, and emotional wealth and spiritual wealth. Those are all components of it. For the sake of this conversation, though, we're going to stick to the money side of wealth and talk about wealth from the perspective of dollars and cents. And with that in mind, with that definition and that leg of the three-legged stool, do y'all desire to be wealthy?
So I saw when I saw that question, it really struck me how my answer has shifted. So if you had asked me that question 20 years ago, 15 years ago, probably even 10 years ago, I would have said no. I would have said that, what was most important to me was being able to do work that felt meaningful and that the money piece wasn't really that important. But my perspective about that has really shifted. And really for the reasons that I described, which is I think that income is one thing and wealth is another. And so I think many of us can look at folks who have great incomes, but when you look at their income versus their debt, they really don't have any sustainable wealth. And so, in order to make that equation work, the income piece really matters, right? And so that's just something that has shifted for me over time. I think about money in a different way. I used to see it as I think I associated it with evil and with misuse of power. And I think now I see that part of that is how you use it.
Absolutely. Well, I'm going to chime in and say yes. Keep it sweet and simple. Pass it on to the next person who'd like to talk about
And
how wealthy you like to be or not.
yeah, I have a desire to be wealthy. And actually, I'm going to text my husband right now and tell him about a lottery ticket because it's up to like $300 something million for this next one. But, often I always think of things like, oh man, if I had X amount of dollars, I'd do this. I'd send some kids to school. I have a whole list of things I would love to be able to do if I had that wealth to do it. So yes, I desire to be wealthy.
And I'll just echo everyone else. I absolutely desire to be wealthy for a whole host of reasons so that I can be free, so that my children and my children's children can be free. Um, and so that we can sort of level up. We as the community, as a people, can do better. And I totally agree with Erica on is how you use it. And I think there are a lot of folks who are beginning to get into the mind frame of using wealth for good, but it's how do we get there? Nobody knows the secret sauce, right? How do we overcome all these different um, barriers that we have that were either constructed or that are our own to get to wealth?
Mhm.
So that's a good thought for us to think on and ponder. Um, so one of the statistics lets us know that while white people own 80% of the wealth in this country. They make up 60% of the population. And that for every $100 of owned assets by whites, $6 is held by Black people. And for the sake of this discussion, and because we are talking to an audience, our definition of Black people today is based around descendants of American slaves. And white people are white people here in these United States of America. So it's not a global perspective that we're talking about, and we're not really bringing in too many immigrant populations into the discussion. It's merely based mostly on Black and white. One of the things that I thought interesting about the quote or the statistic that I just shared about, it stated Black people hold $6 of assets for every $100 owned by whites. What does that say to you, that sentence? Or is there anything about that sentence that stands out to you?
I feel like you're looking for a particular answer.
No,
No,
I am, but I mean, we're here to discuss. I'm going to share it. But
it's disproportionate. And how did it
significantly
disproportionate? Okay.
And so then the question is, how did it get this way, and how do we fix it?
So one of the things that stood out to me with that statement, and it was very common in many of in the research that I was doing, in many of the statements and or statistics that were given, frequently and disturbingly, but also probably accurately, it referred to white people and their money or wealth as ownership and Black people as holding it. So the sentence said, Black people hold, and this is a direct quote, Black people hold $6 of assets for every $100 owned by whites. And that dynamic played through, and I'm talking about lots of resources, not just 5 or 10. I pulled up about 50 articles in preparing for this. Not all of them, but I would definitely say 90% of them had that imbalance of, or accuracy of, how we're holding space and whites are owning space.
Owning it.
And what I thought was good, to Valisa's point of how did we get here and how can we fix it? So I wanted to share a little bit of a very high level and brief deep dive into a timeline of US history that relates to this inequity and injustice and wealth. So for those of our listeners, you can feel free to go in and do some research on your own and dive into more details, but these are just 9 bullet points of events or occurrences that happen that kind of paint the picture of where we are today with that statistic that I led. So from 1619, which is the first documented time when slavery began in the United States. And I put it to 1964, 1965, although we do know that the Emancipation Proclamation was signed into law in 1863. But it was not until 1964 and 1965 Civil Rights Acts that Black people received policy stated freedoms. So from that time period, we went from slavery, emancipation, and Jim Crow. Then from 1865 to 1869, we had Andrew Johnson, who came behind Abraham Lincoln, who decided that we were not going to get our 40 acres and a mule, which was promised to us in the Emancipation Proclamation. Again, us being Black people. In 1874, corrupt management led to the collapse of the Freedom Savings and Trusts, causing widespread loss of trust in banks in the Black community. Some of you may know who are listening, grandparents, aunts, uncles may still put their money under the mattress or in the sugar jar or not in a bank, and definitely not in a checking account, maybe a savings account. In 1881, insurance companies practiced explicit discrimination by declaring that Black customers' policies are worth 1/3 of the value of equivalent policies held by white customers. In 1921, there were riots by white residents that destroyed what we call now Black Wall Street. a vibrant community of Black-owned businesses in Tulsa, Oklahoma. In 1934, the National Housing Act, it puts redlining into practice, excluding Black homeowners from mortgages and keeping them from owning properties in desirable neighborhoods. In 1935, we had the Social Security Act. It was a safety net for workers, but it excluded occupations that were mainly filled by people of color. And the National Labor Relations Act permits unions to exclude them from collective bargaining. In 1969 to present day, welfare reforms worsens the racial wealth gap, and they also overly exert exclusionary policies. And then we also had the stigmatization of Black poverty. And since the mid-90s, the shifting of responsibility from federal government to state-centered models when it comes to our welfare programs. And then finally, the 2013 to the present, the Affordable Care Act, its expanded Medicaid coverage is unavailable to greater than 50% of all Black Americans who live in states that declined to expand the Medicaid coverage. Thankfully, for us here in the state of Ohio, our leadership and governor decided to accept the Obama administration's expanse on Medicaid for the Affordable Care Act, but many states do not. And a lot of those states are heavily populated with Black people. So there's a little background into how we got here. Like I said, very high level. One of the things that we talked about that I just shared and we want to talk about is home ownership and real estate. There is an underlying current of property ownership. Of course, land ownership, we were promised 40 acres and a mule at the end of slavery, but we did not receive that. And we still have policies in place and have had policies in place and written into laws as to how it makes it very hard and unjust for Black people to become homeowners. What benefits do you all think that homeownership provides to you from a wealth perspective or a economic perspective?
I feel home ownership and land ownership definitely gives you an economic advantage. It's an opportunity for you to own equity in your home. So it tends to increase in value. There's just not enough land out there, right? So if you have it's a commodity that you have that becomes an investment. And it adds to your overall portfolio. Hopefully, if you have other items that you've invested in, your retirement fund, your stocks, your mutual funds, it definitely contributes to your overall portfolio. But it also just provides a sense of place and of security that you have your home, your roof over your head, so to say. So it becomes invaluable, definitely in that sense.
Yeah. When I think about this, I think about it's so tricky, right? That so often the things that work well for white folks in terms of accumulating wealth don't work for us in the same ways. And I actually have shifted the way that I think about property and home ownership. So the first house that I bought it, in hopes that one day it was going to support me in accumulating wealth. I also bought a house in 2007, a couple of years before everything completely imploded. And I got out of that house just last year before everything imploded again in a different way around COVID. And to be honest, the house was a loss. That house was a loss for us. And we did theoretically everything right in terms of purchasing something that we could afford. And, it did not support us in accumulating wealth. And it shaped the way that I made the decision when I bought this house that we're living in now, both in terms of where we bought it and in terms of, thinking about it as like, if it helps us accumulate wealth, fantastic. But I bought a house I wanted to live in because it may or may not turn out to be the investment that we hope that it will or that it could be. I think it's often very different for us, and the data tells us that when we buy homes in communities with people who look like us, that the chances of us accumulating wealth as a result are slimmer than they are if we buy homes in communities that are predominantly white. So it's often like you're choosing between money and psychological safety. So, like economic safety versus psychological safety. And it's not a zero sum game, but it is a different thought process for Black folks when they're buying a house.
And we just talk about psychological safety, just so those listening, I, I know what you mean, but can you explain the difference of
Yeah,
the Black community and where you, I think you're saying you would feel more psychologically safer?
yeah, for sure. So when, even though we talk about integration as this sort of kumbaya, beautiful thing, and I think that it can be, it's often fraught. So we are often not wanted in communities, for sometimes because of straight up racism, and sometimes for the reasons that I just described, which is that there's a correlation between the number of Black people in a community and home value. And so, as liberal as white folks might be, and as accepting as they might say they are, there's a tipping point where, like, too much is like, how much is too much and how much is enough in
Mhm.
terms of diversity. But the psychological safety piece is like, well, what is my experience going to be living in this predominantly white community? How am I going to be treated if I have children? What will their experience be in school? How will they be treated? And are we safe, right? Will we be seen as a threat in this community? What's the dynamics with the police department? I mean, there's so much to think about in terms of what the experience will be like that has nothing to do with, you know, uh, is this community on the list of the top best
Mhm.
50 places to live, which other people can go by? Or is it an A-rated school district? Like, that's all great, but that doesn't mean that I'm going to be, frankly, psychologically or physically safe.
Right. And we know that income plays a large part into how we can and what we can afford in a home, in home ownership and mortgage, or even where we live if you are renting. What role do you all feel, believe that income plays in the deficit of Black wealth? How does income contribute to us not having wealth as Black people?
Well, I mean, white people's wealth was subsidized. So as you talk about that timeline, I was thinking about the book When Affirmative Action Was White,
Yep.
and the reality of things like the
Is
GI
white.
Bill. Would you say, Michelle?
Is white. How it is white.
Uh, yeah, that too. Yes, white and female
Right.
in many cases, right?
Mhm.
So that subsidization, is that a word, of white wealth through pushing white folks into the middle class, allowing them to, be the ones who populated the suburbs, and the way in which exponentially so many of those homes have grown in their value. And then also the GI Bill in terms of education, which made a difference for a lot of white families and being able to go to college and then send other. And we have not had that same access. And so when you start to think about the jobs that we have access to, and the way that that's tied to education, and the way that that's tied to housing, right? It's this like self perpetuating cycle. It's structural racism.
At its best. Anyone else, Keisha? How do you think income plays into the absence of Black wealth?
It's definitely a contributor. So as we know, as Black people, we're definitely already at a disadvantage as we're going to get paid less right off the bat. I many a times I have tried to question HR about, well, what are they getting paid compared to what I'm getting paid? Number one, that's just, they say that's not something you should ask. That's usually been my pushback. That's not something we can discuss, but it's usually pretty evident. So just that alone, I'm already not taking home as much as my white peer may be taking home. So I would never be able to accumulate the same amount of wealth as they do, or I can't purchase the same type of home or the same size of home, or maybe I can't get the loan that I wanted to get to send my child to school. So that income difference alone can have some very long lasting impacts on my wealth as a whole, even what I can leave to my children as far as inheritance. And I'm speaking hypothetically, I have no kids. But what can be left maybe to, the organization I want to support
Right.
as an inheritance. So yeah, it definitely has a long-term effect. And I want to circle back real quick to something about the home ownership part, because
Absolutely.
hopefully maybe we can dive deeper in this another time. But even historically from home ownership, like in my family, we've had land. And one big thing that happens is that land is passed on to the next generation. That generation isn't even prepared to take care of that land. The probate process wasn't set up. The wills weren't done. So now there's a dispute between all the kin, and it's divided by, 11 people that now own a fraction of this property, and who's going to pay taxes. So, that even that education and understanding of how we pass that on has been lost in some of these processes and educations and understandings. So then that thus, attributes to us not accumulating that wealth, because there's just some things we don't understand about how you keep wealth.
That's a valid point. Valisa, do you have anything to share about income and how it affects?
So I want to sort of start or go backwards before income, right? There are a lot of white folks who never have to work a day in their lives, and their families may not be quote unquote wealthy. They just have family money, family property, family, and their offspring can sort of hang out with the family and really don't have to have an income in order to move forward, in order to buy a home, in order, their grandmother leaves them their home, their aunt leaves them their home. And it's just, it's all in a pot, and they never even have to think about income. Whereas Black folks definitely have to generally think about, how am I going to get to a point where I can become wealthy? What job or career will generate enough funds for me to then jump into something else that will generate even more money? We have to sort of strategize and think about, how are we going to get from one step to the other. Whereas I find that there are some many white folks who never have to have these strategy conversations, because they are taken care of from day one, and they know that. They can go to college and major in physical education and never, use any skills that they got in college, just, go forward and do whatever they want. And I did want to say something about housing. I think that geography is a part of it, and not just how Erica was describing it. But so I'm originally from Southern California. To buy a regular, just regular, 3-bedroom, 2-bath house in a regular neighborhood, whereas in Cleveland you might pay $80,000-$100,000. In California, that house is going to be $400,000-$500,000.
Absolutely.
That's crazy, right? How am I supposed to buy a regular house on the street for $400,000-$500,000? And I make, because even though things have been inflated, pay has not inflated, and I make $15 an hour. How is that even possible? How do you even consider that? And then you look at your friend whose parents or grandparents, whoever, moved to California 70 years ago, bought land dirt cheap, built a house on it. That house is now worth $1 million. It shouldn't be, but it is. That kid, that grandkid now has generational wealth that we never had an opportunity to even think about. And so of course, these are questions we all consider now. How does income work? How does real estate work in terms of building wealth? But I just think that we have to have these discussions constantly and strategize and figure out how does it work, as Keisha said, whereas some of our white counterparts never have to have these discussions. It's handed to them and they just know, like, this is our generational wealth. It'll continue forth. It's all set up. We don't ever have to do anything but just hand it off. Um, and that makes me crazy. And I want to figure out, how do we as a people make it so that our kids understand the value of handing down real estate, whatever generational stocks, bond, whatever you have, handing that down. Don't live, as my mother and grandmother say, I can't take it with me. I'm gonna spend it all before I leave. Well,
Right.
you don't have to do all that. You know, think about everybody, think about your legacy before you leave. But that's, that comes from way back.
So I do think that there's a percentage of conversation, a percentage of the population of people that you are referring to. I do know that and that represents, the top 10% of wealthy people, which we have already outlined that wealth in this country is held or owned, as many people refer to it, by white people. And there are white people out there who could not identify with the story that you've outlined, but there definitely are many who can. I do think that there are conversations that are had, that it's not just handed down. There definitely are conversations that are had and instruction that's given, because we have to think about it. This is generational. It's not just one generation ago. So our friends who may be in this category of people that you are describing, wealthy white people, their great grandparents have, that generational wealth. So there are conversations, because, Sue needs to know how to give it to Karen, and Karen needs to know how to give it to Beth, and Beth needs to know how to give it to, I'm gonna throw in a Keisha, so no one says that I'm stereotyping names.
I knew you were gonna say Karen.
Karen had to come through. So it does happen, just not to the degree. It doesn't happen in any way in the form that you outlined for us as regular Black people, the majority of Black people. Let's say 99% of Black people in this country don't generally have those conversations, because we generally don't look at it in the way, as you said, about grandma saying we can't leave, don't, better spend it all because you can't take it with you, versus having the mindset of, I can leave it here because there's somebody else here who can then build upon it and grow. And then just one other historical point, Erica, I know you want to jump in here.
That's okay.
I want to say about the land ownership that we were talking about, Felicia, you referenced about the handoff. This goes back to even to that Emancipation Proclamation, whereas we didn't get our 40 acres and a mule, but white Southerners and white Northerners, they did receive an upwards of 120 acres to go and settle out west. So that, we're talking about back in the 1800s, some of that family money, some of the, plantations that some people go and visit as tourist attractions or historical reference points, those have been in those families' lives since the 16, 17, and 1800s, and will continue to be so. So it's a long history of this, not just a recent within our lifetime or those ancestors that we know in their lifetimes. Go ahead, Erica. I'm sorry.
Yeah, no, don't apologize at all. I need to work on my, I really want to say something face. I had two things and they're connected. So one is, it's sort of an alternative to what we've been talking about, which is, you all know, and now everyone who's listening will know that both of my parents are gone. Mm-hmm. So I lost my dad when I was 16, and my mom, I lost my mom in 2008. And, I was thinking, as we're talking about real estate, that another piece of this story of wealth building can be insurance
Absolutely.
and the importance of insurance, and the way that I see so often in our communities when people die, that everybody is trying to scrape together money to bury the dead, which obviously is so important for us to do, but just our lack of life insurance and the way that, when I think about my own life. So when my dad died that was in 1990 when my dad died, the money that my dad left behind was instrumental in me being able to go to college. So my mom used a significant amount of the money that my dad left behind to help finance my education. And my mother, so my dad worked for General Motors, which, back then, this was a time when you could get a good job without a whole lot of education. Neither of my parents finished high school, but they were hell bent that their daughter was going to go to college. And my mom never made much money either. She worked in a laundry department at a nursing home, but she took part of that money to send me to school, and she took another part of that money to pay off the house that I grew up in, because she was like, I'm never gonna, I'm not gonna worry about whether or not just having to afford the mortgage. So that took something off of her plate. And then she just had to worry about the taxes and the other things. And she was always very frugal and very careful with her money. And so when my mom died, the insurance money that she left behind meant that I could pay off some of the debt that I had, not being as savvy as my mother, accumulated myself. And I inherited a home that was paid for. And while that home is not worth nearly as much as it probably should be, it's depreciated because of like the recession and other things, and hasn't completely bounced back. That has been rental income for me, which I would not have had. And my mom also, I benefited uh, from her pension. So for the first 5 years, it wasn't a huge pension, but any money that you didn't have to work to earn is a bonus.
Right.
So, that was money that I also got on a monthly basis for about 5 years after my mom died. So those things have enabled me to do some things that I never would have been able to do without that support, including, probably most importantly, getting myself out of a big hole that I had gotten in debt wise.
So
So
Erica,
I just, I just wanted to share the insurance thing. And I also wanted to make a point that some of this is not about making huge amounts of money, because neither of my parents made huge amounts of money. It really was what they did with the money that they had. And I know that that's not going to in itself close the Black wealth gap, right? I don't want to make it seem like just save your money and everything will be fine. But I do want to make a point that you can make a difference, and we can start to create that foundation for building Black wealth over generations by making some smarter decisions.
So you brought up two really good points that can really segue us into another part of the conversation. One, you referenced the pension of your dad, and then tying that to the real estate. One of the things that I learned in researching for this is that the Black people, our net wealth is pretty much divided between real estate and pension. And whereas white people, it's divided between real estate, retirement accounts, mutual funds, stocks and investments, art, and appreciable assets. So that's really something that we have two things that we kind of add, and we've already said pensions are not something that we can depend upon in this day and age. They were very much a tool for retirement, but that's not something that many people can take to the bank when they retire now. We certainly don't earn pensions. Here we could have retirement accounts, but not a pension account for the jobs, and also the property. But secondly, you talked about how your mom, she was wise with her money and she was frugal and spent it. And you kind of didn't take that, didn't glean too closely to that, as I can testify to that too on my end. So one of the things, and you kind of mentioned this, Erica, one of the things that you can hear from across the spectrum of people about Black people and wealth is that, do y'all think we could be wealthier if we did not spend so much of our income on flossing, buying clothes, Jordans, and luxury cars? What you thought about that? Elisa, you want to chime in here?
I think there are levels to this, right? So yeah, if you work at McDonald's and you make $10 an hour, you need to be focused on using your money efficiently for the things that you need and not buying tennis shoes and a BMW. Like, how do you afford a BMW when you work at McDonald's? If you work at an investment bank and you make $300,000 a year, you perhaps can afford to buy some J's every once in a while, but you also can afford to have an investment portfolio and real estate. And so I think you have to realize where you are. Like, for example, Erica's mom and her dad, they knew where they were and they saved the amount of money they could. They did what they could with what they had. So you have to be smart about what you have. And I think one of the points that your question sort of brings out is that sometimes Black people, many times Black people are not smart about how they spend what they have. They aren't strategic. They just are out here willy-nilly doing whatever because you can't take it with you. I might as well get what I want because I can't, instead of thinking about building as you grow and leaving something behind. I think it's a mindset and it's being smart and strategic about how you do things with what you have.
I've thought about this same question before, because of course you go through a neighborhood, apartment building, anywhere, you see a very nice car in the parking lot, and you just start thinking about it. Or you're out at the club and somebody has on, some Jimmy Choos or whatever, and it makes you wonder about just the desire to have things, and where does that come from in our history? Because I definitely think it's something that's passed on. So, let's go back a couple of generations. It was, the grandmother that worked and worked and worked to make sure that her kids could have the best, to make sure that they were clean. Because if you're clean and if you're dressed nice, then people look at you differently. You have to present yourself in a certain way. So they would spend money on that. And then, so that child thought that that's then what you do with your money. You spend it, not really understanding that maybe there was a different rhyme or reason of why, grandma made you always dress your Sunday best. So then, they took it to another level and would do that for every occasion. So I think some of that is just unfortunate learned behavior. But also it is the lesson of, finances, of economics, of investments, and understanding that, I don't need to buy these Jordans. Actually, if I save this, $100 that I may spend every quarter, then that adds up and I can actually, maybe then buy, 20 shares of Apple, which are going to definitely appreciate. And maybe Jordans aren't a great example because apparently you can get some vintage Jordans, they sell those at a high amount. So maybe that's not the best example, but understanding that it's not about the thing, but about the investment. I think we kind of missed on that education. It just turned it into something different about what's on the outside, not, what we have saved in the bank, on the backside.
I feel like our sister Erica might have a different take on this. I definitely have a different take on it. So I'm going to let you jump in and see if you cover anything that I might say. But I feel like there might be some differences of opinion. I know I have a slightly different thought.
yeah, I struggle with this. I am of two minds. And I on the one hand, I feel like we get over criticized that materialism is American, right? Obsession with stuff is rooted in capitalism. Like this whole system works by keeping us all believing that there's something wrong with us and that we need stuff in order to fix it. Whether you are white, whether you are black, no matter what your background is, that is the message. And so I like this is a place where I feel like we get into policing poor people and all kind of stuff in a different way. So this is, so part of me is like, yes, where we should spend our money strategically, we should spend our money wisely, we should do all of these things. I believe that. I also think that sometimes you are so far, well, two things. One, sometimes people literally have nothing to save. And the way that you get things, I mean, let's face it, there's an underground economy. So just because I see somebody with something, right, and I have a judgment about that thing, or I think, it costs however much, I could be wrong about how they spent or didn't spend, or whether they bartered for that, or how they, however they got it. But the other thing is just that policing of poor people and holding them to a standard that I think is wrong and unrealistic, and somehow expecting us to not also fall prey to capitalism. It just, yeah, that bugs me. And I do think, like, we all, how many of you have, there are things that it does make you feel better, like retail therapy is a thing.
It's real.
And our, like, I'm looking at
Amazon could attest to it for during this pandemic.
Oh my God, we're not even gonna talk about loungewear and all kind of other crap that I've been buying when people can only see me from the, not even from like the shoulders up, but
bear coats, I might add.
Oh, right.
Talk about furry coat. That coat was $20, ma'am.
Resourcefulness. Circling back to what you said.
$20.
You never know.
But I do think that there's also something, like, there's so many things about the world that make us feel awful about who we are. And that is something we can control. So we can't always control where we live and whether we can buy a house that's going to accumulate wealth. But maybe that Apple phone or those tennis shoes or that purse or that outfit is actually within reach. And I mean, none of it is healthy, probably, right? For any of us, no matter how much money we have. But I guess I empathize with it. I understand it to a certain point, and I think we just have to be really, really, really careful.
I think that's what I was.
But the question was, is it stopping us from building wealth, right?
I don't necessarily, but I think that sometimes we're so doggone far from wealth. Like, I'm not sure I believe that it is.
I don't think so. I'm sorry. What'd you say, Valisa?
Erica is saying, should that even be the question, depending on your level of income? Like, you're not going to get to wealth anyway. Is that?
No, I mean, I hate to sound defeatist or be negative, but I think sometimes, yeah, you're so confounded far from that you can't even think about it. I mean, I can think about some of my own experiences, and it took me forever. Like, I would have told y'all I was so broke, and I had to learn the difference between situational poverty and generational poverty.
Right.
And what I've experienced is situational, like, I understand that now. What I've experienced is situational poverty, which many of us have a story about. Oh, I was so broke in college, or I was so broke in my 20s, or whatever. But a lot of times we had a safety net. Mm-hmm. And so there's a difference between being Like, oh, I really, I'm trying to get that last $5 out of the ATM, so I could get like 5 wings and fries.
Right.
And my family has been poor for generations. Like, those are two very different things. So anyway, I'm I'm coming back from the rabbit hole. Go ahead, Michelle.
And I also think you did touch on, as I thought you might touch on some of the things that I feel about the image or the look of flossing, or people being judged by the things that they have or the things that they purchase with their money, or how we judge people for spending it based on what we perceive their income to be or what we know their income to be. I do think that, there is a perceived, or actually a real value in purchasing something and finding some type of value in yourself, or getting some type of gratification. As Erica, you said, society, we have been indoctrinated into a capitalist society that tells us that things make us feel better. Whether that be true or not, we have, for the most part, purchased that concept, and we spend it, and we spend it back regularly on an ongoing basis. And I do think that when someone has an opportunity to do something to put a little shine on themselves or on their life, or some of the conditions or the situations that they might be living in or finding themselves in, if that, as Erica said, that iPhone, or if that pair of sneakers, or if that pair of hoops makes them put a little pep in their step, so be it. I also know, outside of looking at lower income or lower wealth individuals or families or people, that there is still, to Keisha's point about how, back in the day when you would get dressed, and or you wanted to be clean, you wanted your house to be neat, you want, even if your family was on welfare or government assistance, it was important that the home looked a certain way, that it was clean. Just because we are on welfare, just because we are receiving this assistance, does not mean that our house has to look like a pigsty or anything like that. We still have pride. We still have to carry ourselves in a certain way. Bringing that forward, and that still exists in households today, but bringing it forward, I also think that, Felicia, you referenced the having the BMW and you can't afford it. Well, there's a lot of people out here who make $300,000 who can't afford a BMW. But one of the things that does, if you are making the $80,000 job income, and you do have the BMW, which might not be the car that you could on paper afford to have, a lot of it plays into what we need in order to get to where we are going. So if you've been blessed to have a position at that investment firm, and you're not making, because we talked about income inequality, you're not making the amount of money that your white female counterpart is making, but you can't show up in an outfit that looks like you're not making what the white counterpart is making. You still have to dress the part. You still have to go and get your Brooks Brothers suit and show up like you're an investment banker. Now, whether you paid Brooks Brothers money for this suit, that's a different story. But you still have to perform. It's a performance that all of us are doing, not just Black people, but all of us are doing. You still have to perform. And there's still levels of expectation on how you show up and what that looks like. And that is mostly tied to the things that you have. And whether you paid for it, the prices that are at Neiman's and Saks, or you were able to go, like, I'm vintage 101, I will buy my Jimmy Choo's didn't come from the Jimmy Choo store for Neiman Marcus. They came from, the vintage store in, up in Manhattan. So, you can still be resourceful in it, and some people are not. Some people are still spending the money, but there is pressure outside of just someone wanting to just be wasteful, or not or just throw willy-nilly, throw their money around. I think there's just a lot of factors that play into it, and there are people who just cannot hold money. It's like, water. It just flows through them. So that's that. And there are wealthy people or rich people and poor people who have that same condition, if we can call
As
it
far
that.
as building community wealth, we've talked about how, our money leaves our community faster. And some of that is, attributed to, maybe the floss factor. So if I need to go buy all of these different things, it's not within my community. There's not the Black designers or, the Black car manufacturer or, whatever this floss item is may not necessarily be in our community. So that need then contributes or is a part of our community not building that wealth. And how can these purchases, which I do is fine. I would hate to have to, or I hate to pour shame, because I think it is nice to have something, special that you want and that you desired and you saved for it and you got it. It is a wonderful feeling. But how can we make sure that those decisions are strategic, or how can we make sure that those decisions are based on, a budget, or, that they've actually thought about these purchases and how it can affect them long term.
Yeah,
I know
so
that Lisa had brought up the point of discussion when we first set out on the conversation to talk about how to get to, the Black wealth. How can we get on a, I don't know if we want to call it a course correction because we didn't put ourselves on this path, but how we can move into that. So one of the ways that has been around since 1863 is reparations. So I want to move us into talking about one, do we believe that Black Americans, and by that again, I mean descendants for this, especially for this part of the conversation, descendants of enslaved Americans, should we receive reparations? And if you can just shout out your yes or no answer to that.
Yes.
Yes, I'm gonna say yes.
Yes.
What that looks like, I don't know, but yes.
Right, but yes. And Valisa? Yes or no?
It's the attorney.
A yes or no question?
Yes, it was a yes or no question because we're going to move into the question, but is it yes or no?
Oh,
Do you believe that Black people should receive reparations?
My answer is it depends.
Okay. So we can start with Valisa because that was not a yes. So it's more of a no. Because
no, it depends. Not yes, or no, it depends.
Okay. So would you like to expound upon that?
It depends on what the reparations are.
Oh, well, yeah, of course it depends. So we're not, that's why I said we're not getting into what the reparations are. Do you believe, that's putting judgment on the question, do you believe that Black Americans, descendants of enslaved people, should receive reparations? No judgment of what that reparation is. That's a yes or no question.
That's a really loaded question. I just can't give you a yes or no. I guess
Okay.
I'll say yes.
No, don't be forced to say it. Don't be forced to say it.
I just don't think that's a yes or no question. That's a very loaded question that needs to be unpacked.
Okay. So, so for those of us who believe yes, with that, what do you feel like those reparations would look like? If you had, I have like a 5-list thing that I have created about 4 years ago. So I'd be curious to know what your thoughts are on what that looks like.
Keisha, did you want to go?
Yeah, I was about to say, I haven't necessarily thought of the what.
Now.
Yes, I don't know exactly what I want the reparation to be, how it is distributed. I do believe that all descendants of slaves should receive some type of reparation. But what I did see recently that's being done right now in Great Britain is kind of a research on some of the beneficiaries of slavery. So I kind of like that same concept. Like, let's look at the companies in the United States or the families who significantly benefited from, slavery activities. And then, and not only then, but how that has played out over the course of history to now, like what has that wealth been built on the backs of slaves? And and somehow take that and distribute it maybe for education, improving communities or something. But I think that's a good place to start. You know, our free labor, what did it contribute to this country? Can we put a monetary value to that?
Yes, we can.
Yeah.
Erica, you want to?
Yeah, for me, I think there are many options, right? I think wiping out all of our student debt, I think putting funds aside for our education, whether that is vocational training or whether that's a 4-year institution. I think there should be money that we could have access to so that we don't have to continue to accumulate educational debt. I think money for purchasing property or for starting a business. I think potentially being exempt from federal income tax for some period of time, like to have the money that we're making actually go into our pockets and not into the hands of the federal government. I think those are some different options that I'm not necessarily, I'm not necessarily like write us a check. Kind, I think that I've always believed that if that happens, when everything's not fixed, which it won't be, just from writing a check, that it'll be like, well, we gave you that money. What's wrong with you? So I think that there has to be some other kind of more sustainable over time strategy, and that if people choose not to invest in property or start a business uh, or follow some path around education or some sort of vocation or trade that, right, if we're talking about building wealth, then I think those are some options.
So for me, a lot of that aligns with the things that I mentioned that I've been thinking about for the past 4 years. And I definitely feel from the camp that reparations do include cash payment. Reparations historically to people who have been wronged by governments governments have included cash payments, even historically here in the United States. The Japanese receive reparations. Those who are affected and impacted by 9/11 received reparations. And of course, we know that Germans have paid reparations to those who are survivors and ancestors of the Holocaust, reparations, which were cash payments. They were not loans for school, paybacks, property. It was cash payments. So I do believe that any form of reparation that we would receive from the United States government would come in the form of a cash payment. I've narrowed it down to specifically that to whenever this conversation actually, I know in Congress they are putting together a coalition to study reparations and what that would look like. Have no idea if that study would end in our lifetimes, which really saddens me. I hope that it is like a 2 to 3 year study, and then we come out of that with a plan. I know a lot has been placed on like wiping out student debt or providing student education. Well, for someone like me and other people who don't have student debt, I don't want to be on the outs of it. I do feel that all ancestors of all descendants of our ancestors who were enslaved people should receive benefit from that. Outside of that, what it looks like for me is $1 million up until a point of birth, and whenever this happens, pay out $250,000 that individuals can use for towards purchase of a home or education, depending on what space in life you are, or to fund a business. I do stand in line with the elimination of federal income tax for a period of time. I haven't wrapped down the economics about what time that would be, or for what time frame that would be. life insurance policy, which is something that we talked about, that Black people be given a life insurance policy to at least cover, at minimum, the funeral expenses for the deaths. Excuse me. Those are some of the things. And then the 250,000 would not be a cash payment. It would be put towards, it would be put in a fund to either fund education, wipe out student debt, fund a business, or things of that nature. And if you choose not to do such, then that's fine. But I do strongly feel, as I've said multiple times, that cash payments are, and what that amount looks like. I put out $1 million, and there's, pushback within a lot of outside and inside the community about, amount of money. Given the amount of money that this country spends on one military plane, brilliant, we have the money to do it. And I feel like, I don't say it in any, I don't feel like we should mince words or be apologetic in trying to figure out what would be appropriate. I don't think that there's any amount that would be appropriate, but I think that that is a start, and it would definitely level the playing field. And I do feel at that point, if those things, and maybe some other people have some things to add to it, not necessarily in this conversation, but other people have plans. A lot of them came up during this election cycle about plans. I'm all for the plans. But I do feel that at that point, if we were to receive the things that I mentioned, you could say, well, what's the problem now? In some respects, everybody is not going to become wealthy because of this. That is not going to happen, but it definitely course corrects a lot, and it provides you the opportunity to do a lot with it, and to move yourself as well as your family or any community or organization that you want to advance forward in a healthy and wealthy, positive way. So those are my thoughts about the yes.
And I don't know if possible, but I would like to see, and I do feel like maybe some families lost more than others. And I don't know how you would definitely calculate that, but one way is land taken. So there are definitely many stories where people of color have had land, and the powers that be took it through eminent domain, or said they didn't pay their tax or something. A lot of our land has been lost. So including that in the reparation, or assessing the value of that and including it into that family line. And then also income loss. So if you've ever been to the lynching museum, you see all of those heads of households that have been killed. That was potential income that then could have contributed to that family, and over time, how that could have developed that generational wealth as well. So how do we capture, some of those, making sure that is, accounted in the record books as a part of this reparation? I mean, I like the idea of a lump sum, but there's just even more than just that lump sum. This is bigger, is what we've already lost, as well as what we didn't even have the opportunity to gain. So how do we account for that?
$1 million.
Yeah,
Lisa, what do you? Yeah, I want to know what you think, Miss Baby. It depends.
It depends on what it is, and that answer was more of a, if you just want to give us a payment, no, because I think it's some of all of what all three of you have already said, right? Keisha said we need to do the research and figure out what was lost, sort of put us back on an even playing field with everyone else who moved through life with their legacy and their money and while we were being held back. We need a cash payment as well. And we also need all the things that Erica was talking about as well, in terms of, and Michelle, everyone gets a life insurance policy. I think it's a myriad of things that need to come together to make one package. It's not just one.
Yes.
Thing. I'm sorry?
So there is an answer for you. It's yes, you do believe that Black people should receive reparations.
Yes. if they do it right. I don't want them to be like, here, have this.
That's not what we said though, Billy. So we just asked, or I just posed the question of should it happen, and then you went and put the layers on top of it. But that was the second.
But I guess I've read so many articles. I've seen so many interviews with white folks who are, you know, talking about what they think we should get. And I'm like, I don't want your reparations. I want our reparations.
Well,
Our
absolutely.
idea of what reparations are. So
Yeah.
I put, you're right. I put my own layers on that because what some people think are reparations, I do not. So
But the
no.
answer is yes.
Depends on what they are.
Okay. So I'm going to take my $1 million check. If Elisa can leave hers on the table, if they come with that, and she can, you know, just dissect
Oh,
that.
if that's the only thing they want to give us,
No, I'm just saying. I'm just speaking for Felder over here. You know, but no, I listed a list of 5 things that I felt like we should be included in that. So it's not just cash payment. I'm totally on board with what Keisha shared and what Erica shared. It's a comprehensive package.
Yeah.
But what does, just like the whole payment part scares you, the whole, when I hear about this wiping out of student loan debt, and I get that there is serious student loan debt, I just don't have any. So I'm speaking.
Yeah. No, I agree.
Yeah.
It
I don't
can't just be
want
that either.
reparations for Black people.
It can't just be that either. That's right.
No, I hear that, and I think that is a good and valid point, and it actually made me think about something we didn't talk about as much. I think it was Keisha who brought up at the beginning. Maybe there should be universal health care built into this reparations process as well, right? So we just know how many families go bankrupt because of debt around healthcare. And we also know that our community is suffering health wise, particularly in this moment. So that could be another piece of this puzzle or of this process too.
I'm fully in agreement with that. I neglected to say that was on my list, but I don't
It was
have
on
it
your
in
list.
front of me. But yeah, it's on the 5. I think I only put out 3 because I'm still, the 5th one is still escaping me. But yes, I'm in agreement with that fully. Well, universal health care
Well, and it's gonna take something. I think it's gonna take something radical. As much as people perhaps don't like that word, or immediately when you hear radical, people go to like militancy. I'm not talking about it from that perspective. I'm saying you don't close a gap that has been created over more than 400 years by scrimping and saving.
right.
Right?
Right.
We are not going to scrimp and save our way to parity when it
Right.
comes to the station of Black folks in this country. It's just unrealistic. Frankly, it's impossible. And there's some really fantastic research. I think about the Insight Institute, which is done, the Insight Center, which is done some out of California. They've done some amazing research, and they basically say that all of the things that we think will close the wealth gap won't. So we can't educate ourselves out of it. We can't save ourselves out of it. We can't start a business ourselves out of it. Right? None of those things.
More money, have
We
higher.
might build individual wealth by doing
Right.
those things, but we are not going to get our community,
Yeah.
our collective selves to parity by doing those things, because they just don't reap the same reward for us. I mean, we know even an Ivy League education for us is the equivalent of a state institution for white folks. So nothing that we do on our own is going to close the racial wealth gap. We
Right.
need something radical.
I totally agree. And I think that that is a perfect way for us to round out our segment, our episode today, that we need something radical. And for all of our listeners and watchers, viewers of our podcast, we thank you so much. And we encourage you to go out and do some research, do some examination, and figure out ways in which you can contribute to your own personal wealth, family's wealth, and or our community's wealth, and figure out ways in which we can be radical and, going after this 40 acres and a mule. So
So
thank you so much.
sorry,
Yes.
Elder, before one thing, I feel like we cannot end this conversation
Uh-huh.
without talking about the Work Towards Wealth grant, right? Which is our collective contribution to trying to have an impact and make a difference. Keisha, do you want to give like a 2-minute or less plug
Sure.
for the Work Towards Wealth grant?
Absolutely. The Work Towards Wealth grant, we issue that quarterly. And the purpose of the grant is to support an African American female woman business owner. We want to make sure that she has funds to maybe implement a special project that will boost her revenue or allow her to purchase equipment that'll make her operations more efficient. So it's $1,000. That's what the grant is for. So it's small, but hopefully it's small and mighty, where it'll help a small business to do some things that they weren't able to do before. Please check. Well, hopefully you're a member of Black Women Work and you're a part of our Facebook group, because we definitely make those announcements there. And it can be found at bwwcle.com. More information will be posted there as well.
Thank you, Keisha. That's BWWCLE at Gmail.
CLE.
All right. Well, thanks so much again for joining us. And until next time, Kwanzaa blessings to everyone.